So,
Vanessa.
without further ado, Vanessa is online, right? Hi, Vanessa. It is a great pleasure to present to you Vanessa Teague. She is Vanessa is a researcher in computer security and privacy. She has been doing that since she graduated and during her study in Stanford in 2005. She worked a lot, actually, in de-identification attacks, on protecting elections. You might have heard of her recent results about the Swiss election companies. She was very vocal, and she's still very vocal about the Australian anti-encryption laws, which resonate the big crypto wars of the 90s. Apparently, like any good trend, it arrives to Australia 20 years too late. And she was very critical, she's still very critical of the Australian contact tracing app, and we will hear about her more about that, more about the contact tracing, but today about the identified data. Vanessa, the floor is yours.
Terrific. Thank you all, and thank you for inviting me. I'm sorry that I can't be there in person, but I hope the video works. All right. I'm going to talk about why de-identified data probably isn't. This is joint work with Chris Culnane and Ben Rubenstein. And really the short summary is, if you take a individual person's detailed record and you try and remove a bit of information about it to hide whose record it is, that almost certainly doesn't work. The first that I heard about this result was reading the following fantastic paper called Unique in the Crowd, the Privacy Bounds of Human Mobility. And if you haven't had a look at this, you should go and find it because it's a wonderful paper. Yves Alexandre de Montjoy and his colleagues looked at some time and space data from mobile phones. In other words, for each person with a phone, they've got a sequence of data points which say where that person was at various times through the day over a period of a couple of weeks. And what they did was take quite granular snapshots of space and time, but string together a few different points from each person and try to see how many points it takes to make a person's trace unique. And the important thing is to look at this colored graph in the very beginning, in the very middle of the slide, because it's telling you how many space-time points it takes to uniquely identify an individual. And as you can see, the number that it takes is really small, right? It's kind of somewhere between about 2 and 4. And if you've got 3 different ideas of where a person was when, then you can uniquely identify more than 80% of people. So this is either, depending on how your brain works, this might be completely obvious or really counterintuitive. I found it really counterintuitive when I first looked at it because you feel like you're lost in a large crowd, right? Maybe you went to the football on the weekend and then you went to work in a big crowded office building and then you went home to your house in the suburbs. In each of those places, there's probably thousands of other people within a radius of 50 meters of you. And you don't feel as if your location is easily spotted. And yet, if we start to conjoin together 2 or 3 constraints of this form, there's probably almost nobody who was in the same suburb as you in the evening and at the footy with you on the weekend and also works at about the same place that you do. So we can take quite large sets of people or quite large fractions of the population. But as soon as we start taking the intersections of those sets, we are rapidly pinning down one particular person. So this result is either obvious or counterintuitive, depending on how your brain works. Another way to look at it, if you come from a mathematical kind of direction, is if I think of your data record and all the times and places that you were as one great big vector of information, then there's a tremendous amount of information in that vector. And the fact that all the points aren't entirely unique doesn't really significantly reduce that amount of information. It's still huge, right? So even though most people tend to live at the same place and then work at the same place, if you've got a few weeks worth of information about them, you've probably still got heaps of extra information about where they went shopping and where their friends are and what they do on the weekend and so on. Now, removing precision from the data, like taking larger areas of land for the location specification and taking larger time periods for figuring out when people were at places, changes this calculation a little bit, but not much. So this paper goes on to discuss what happens when they take more and more granular pieces of data, and it basically doesn't matter. It matters a little bit, but not nearly as much as you might think. This result that if you string 2 or 3 or 4 different points of information about a person together, you can almost always uniquely identify that person, is remarkably robust and carries across a whole lot of different data sets with all kinds of different unique personal records. So let's have a look at some data sets. I think I said that already. A few ordinary data sets, a few ordinary data points suffice to make almost anyone unique. Okay, so here's a plan for the rest of my talk. I'm going to take 3 examples, all Australian. Although note that Australia is a federal system, so these are actually stuff-ups by 3 different Australian governments. The first one is by the federal government, who are responsible for administering our centralised medical and pharmaceutical benefit scheme. The second example is from the Victorian state government, which is where I live, and it's a transport data set. Very, very similar result, very similar size of data, different domain. And then at the end, I'm going to have a brief look at the open data portal of another state, Queensland. And just look at each point. These go in chronological order, and we're going to talk about what we've learned as we went along. So the title of my talk, by the way, is in homage to Cynthia Dwork, and this is the exact quote from her. She says, "Succinctly put, de-identified data isn't, and the culprit is auxiliary information." So in other words, once we've figured out that a person's record makes them unique, we may not actually necessarily know who they are unless we have some other source of information about them that fills in those data points that make that person unique. So we're going to talk about what kind of data it takes to re-identify, what kind of auxiliary data it takes to re-identify a person in some of these Australian open data sets. And I guess in some ways the point of this talk is to say there's nothing surprising about anything I'm about to say. In fact, really the only surprising thing is that this keeps happening and these results keep being ignored. So you could have read the Unique in the Crowd paper, which came out before any of these examples. And if you'd read that paper, thought about what it was saying, you would never have dreamed of publishing any of this data online. And yet they did. All right, so here's my first example. This is a federal government data set derived from the federal government's reimbursements for Australian publicly subsidised healthcare. So we're not talking about doctors' notes. We're talking about the bills that get sent to the federal government when every Australian has some kind of medical procedure. Medical procedures, doctor's visits, tests, and also pharmaceutical bills. So a typical record includes, or a typical file in the record includes something like the date on which the medical procedure happened, an ID that identifies the doctor, a price, right? The price that it cost and the price that was reimbursed, and some and specific information, a billing number describing exactly what the procedure was. Now, what they did with this data is for each patient, they joined together all the medical and pharmaceutical benefits that they'd paid over the 30-year period from 1984, when the scheme was first introduced, to 2014. So that's a huge amount of data, right? I was alive in 1984. There are most people who are my age have hundreds and hundreds of records, one way or another. And for each patient, they're all linked together. They then took 10% of the patients, which is about a bit over 2.5 million people. And for that lucky 10%, they decided that they were going to publish all of this information online with each person's record all linked to each other. Now, they weren't completely unaware of the possibility that people might care about the privacy consequences of this. So they de-identified the data. First of all, they decided that they were going to encrypt the identities of both doctors and patients. So not the data, just the IDs. But encrypted gets scare quotes because they decided that instead of being boring and using a standard algorithm, they'd make up their own encryption algorithm. They didn't feel the need to use a key. They just used a deterministic thing they'd made up. And if you look at our paper, you can see that it's unsurprisingly not very hard to reverse. But that's not actually the topic of the talk. The topic of the talk is about patient data, which they de-identified by randomly perturbing dates by plus or minus 14 days. They also removed individual rare events. So if you had one particular medical issue that was very rare, that I think was removed from the data set. They left in a little bit of demographic information about each patient. So they told us what year the patient was born in, but not the exact date of birth. They told us whether the patient was male or female, and it's pretty easy to figure out what state the person lives in. But there's not much other detailed demographic information. I think they thought that that was helping. So this data was sort of de-identified, but again, think about the relative amounts of information that we've got compared to the amount of information that they've hidden. So they've taken this massive detailed record that says everything, every bill that an Australian sent to the government related to healthcare, right? Every test, every visit to the doctor, every surgery, every pharmaceutical. Not quite every pharmaceutical that was reimbursed by the government. And what they've done is chosen one number from plus 14 to minus 14 and perturbed all the dates in that one person's record by the same amount, somewhere in a range of 28 different numbers, 29 different numbers. So if you just think about the information, how much detail there is about each person versus how much effort they've gone into obscuring that detail, I hope it's clear that this is crazy. Right, this is insane, and there's no way that this is an adequate protection against identifying people based on auxiliary information. So before I go on, I want to make clear how sensitive this information is, because although we haven't got doctor's notes or test results or anything like that, the pharmaceuticals in particular reveal tremendously detailed information, tremendously potentially sensitive information about a person. So for example, if you have a test for HIV, that doesn't necessarily prove anything about you, and there's no test result in this data set. But if you're getting reimbursed for a medication that is only used to treat HIV, then that's a very, very strong indication that you've tested positive for that condition. So the combination of Medicare and pharmaceutical bills is particularly sensitive and particularly likely to reveal very, very personal and private things about people. If you want to look in the details of the paper, it's at the bottom of the slide. So let's have a little bit of a look about how this works. We began by looking at how much medical information people share online. And when I first started looking at this, I hadn't really inputted the key message of the Unique in the Crowd paper. And I was looking for people about whom I could find 2 or 3 medical events, thinking that that constituted 2 or 3 points of information. What I realized, of course, is that one medical event is actually in many cases already 2 or 3 points of information. You've got a date, you've usually got a state or some kind of location about the thing, you've usually got an exact description of what the thing is. And so in the beginning, I was trying to look for people who had recorded online multiple different kinds of health events, like footballers who had had multiple different kinds of surgeries or injuries, or politicians who had had a couple of different heart attacks or whatever. But in fact, I found, first of all, that was relatively hard work. And second of all, it wasn't necessary, that even one or two events, including one event in some cases, is often enough, because there's enough information in one event to uniquely identify a person in these records. Okay, so here's what we did. About 70 queries overall, just based on the kind of information that you just saw on the slide, plus some people who came to me and asked me if I would look for their records. Most of those queries had no matches in the sample. Remembering again that this is only a 10% sample, so we've got longitudinal data for 10% of the population. So you would expect that 90% of people are not there. And in some ways, the fact that most of the time you don't find a match is kind of comforting, because it's an indication that you're not getting a lot of false matches, right? If everybody who asked me, or everybody I found, allowed me to find a match in the data set, then I'd be very suspicious that I didn't have enough information to distinguish a genuine match to somebody in the 10% sample from a mistaken coincidental resemblance to somebody who was actually in the 90% who were not published. But most of the things I tried to look up, especially with one relatively unusual medical event or two or more medical events, were not present in the sample at all. Couldn't find any matches, including for myself. So if you look up when my 2 Australian children were born, there's nobody who matches me. 10 of the things that I looked at returned a unique match. So again, if you just kind of look at it from a distance and with a rough, is this roughly the matching rate that we would expect? From about 70 queries, we're getting a little over 10% uniquely matched. And that indicates perhaps a small rate of coincidental matching to the wrong person, but it certainly doesn't indicate a large rate of mistaken matches. So in some cases, we've really only got one data point, albeit one data point with some more detail, and there's a fair chance of a coincidental resemblance to somebody who's actually not in the sample. We could be wrong. In other cases, we can be very confident that the person we think we've identified in the sample really is the person we think. So we notified the Australian Department of Health about this in December of 2016, and then after giving them a year to do something decent about it, which they didn't, we eventually went public with our work in December of 2017. So now I want to talk about this question of confidence, because one of the things that the authorities responded with when we told them about this issue was an assertion that because the sample was only 10% of the population, it wasn't possible to be confident of having correctly identified a person. They asserted that there was always a chance of a mistake, and therefore there was no privacy problem, and therefore patients were not identifiable, and they didn't have to notify anybody affected by the problem, because there wasn't a problem, because there was never any, because it was always possible that an identification was mistaken. So let's look at confidence. Now, the first thing to say about confidence is, remember Cynthia's thing about auxiliary information, right? Let's look for some other sources of information which might allow us to be confident about a re-identification in the 10% longitudinal sample. Well, the first thing to notice is that the Australian government publishes a great quantity of auxiliary information, and the most useful of which is this set, which is aggregated group statistics of Medicare bills. So this is the same bills, right? Same bills, but presented in a completely different way. This data set does not take a great big longitudinal linked together record of one patient. Instead, it sort of does the dual thing. It says, let's look at all of the people who were reimbursed for a certain thing in a certain state in a certain month. And then let's gather them together according to their a 10-year wide age range and their gender and a couple of other things. So I cannot in this data set look at one person and say, oh, this person went to the doctor at this time and then had a test for this thing and then was reimbursed for this pharmaceutical. That's what the 10% longitudinal sample is for. This aggregated data set only gives me individual snapshots of kind of one-off bills. And it tells me how many people billed that thing at that time within that demographic. So for most of these things, there's thousands of them, or hundreds of them, or at least dozens of them. And there's no possibility that you could uniquely identify whose record is whose, because dozens of people have precisely identical little records. But that's not always the case. Some people have relatively unusual medical conditions or relatively unusual surgical procedures or pharmaceuticals. And for some of the people, we can see that they're the only person with a record of that kind, even though the record is sort of aggregated. It's only got one person in it. So here's an example. This is from Queensland in the month of August 2011, and it says a 45 to 54-year-old man had an aortic valve replacement in Queensland in that time. Now, if I look through all the rest of this data set, I can see that actually he's the only one. Only one person had this surgery in this state, in this demographic, in that month. Now, there are no patient IDs. There's no opportunity to link this record to any of the other records in that data set. But there's auxiliary information, because if I look up the Sydney Morning Herald, I can see that former Prime Minister Kevin Rudd, who is a 45 to 54-year-old man, had heart surgery in August of 2011 in Queensland. And we know what that heart surgery was because there's quite a bit of detail about it on the internet. So we know that that record that I showed you on the previous slide is the unique record of former Australian Prime Minister Kevin Rudd. Now, it isn't really a disaster to be able to identify that record because we don't learn from it anything that we didn't already know. Or nothing that we didn't already know from the newspaper anyway, which presumably he consented to sharing. So that's not a catastrophe in and of itself. However, I could now do a search in the 10% longitudinal data set for that same person. Fortunately, and I wouldn't be giving a talk about it if he was in the data set, but fortunately he's not in the data set. But if he was in the data set, and remember 10% of Australians are in the 10% longitudinal data set, then we could use the global population-wide uniqueness that we've inferred from the aggregated data set in order to prove that he's correctly identified in the 10% longitudinal data set. And if he was correctly identified in the 10% longitudinal sample data set, then we'd be able to pull out all of his other tests and medications and medical procedures from 1984 to 2014. So the important thing here is we can use a different information about population-wide uniqueness to prove correct re-identification even in a 10% sample. Okay, so Mr. Rudd had a relatively uncommon surgery. Let's have a think about whether how could we make a confident re-identification for people who didn't have any one particular very unusual event. Let's have a think about childbirth. Childbirth is very common. In fact, childbirth records are among the most common records in the Medicare data set, pretty much the most common thing after just generic visits to the family doctor. And if you've only had one baby, then there's likely a large number of other women who have also had a baby on the same date. But if you have 2 or 3 children, and lots of women do, then the number of other mums who have had children, 2 or 3 other children who exactly match on all of those 2 or 3 dates, rapidly becomes very, very small. So again, we see this pattern. It's not that there's nothing particularly unusual about having a baby. There's nothing that makes you unique or weird about having a baby. But if we start restricting the population according to who's had a baby at 2 or 3 different points, then we very, very rapidly reach a situation where we can uniquely spot any particular individual. So let's have a think about re-identifying people in the Medicare and PBS sample based on childbirth dates. Now, if you already know what K-anonymity is, it's a method of trying to protect privacy by making sure that when you look at a person's demographics, there are other people in a large crowd in which that person is lost. So if we look only at the demographics of this data set, remember, I think I said we only have year of birth, gender, and state. And in that case, you're hidden in a crowd of thousands, right? There's thousands of other people in that same group. And I think that's what they thought they were doing when they published it online. I think they thought they protected everybody by making sure that the demographics didn't reveal who was who. But of course, as soon as we start looking at the data, we start finding out exactly who's who. So this is the story of me trying to re-identify my friend Mary, whose name is not really Mary, but who is actually a real person, who came to me and asked me if I would look to see whether her data had been published, because she was very concerned. And she has 3 babies. First of all, let's just look at Mary's demographics. She was born in the 1970s. And if I look for other women who were born in the same year as her, she's lost in a crowd of more than 19,000 people. Nothing to worry about there. Everybody feels very confident and relaxed if you think there are 19,000 other people whose health records could be confused with yours. And even if we add state, for example, we still get many thousands of people. But as soon as we start looking at the data points, specifically when her children were born, we rapidly cut down that space of possible matches. So let's just add a query for the first child that she had. And remember, there's a random perturbation by plus or minus 14 days. We don't know exactly what that's going to be. So when I run a database query, I just query for a childbirth event within the 28-day window, 14 days either side of when I know her child was born. So as you can see, we immediately cut down the search space rapidly, right? We've gone from 19,000 people to 51. And when I'm giving this talk in front of a real crowd, I usually look everybody in the eye and ask them what they think is going to happen next when I do the obvious next thing, which is now I'm going to add an additional query for a match with her second child, right? How many of those 51 women who had a baby on the same date as Mary's first baby are going to also have a baby within the right date range to match Mary's second baby? So have a little think about that for yourself. Imagine we're actually sitting in a proper lecture theatre where we can speculate together. What do you think the answer is going to be? Okay, let's see. Guess what? It's exactly 1. So there's either a coincidental resemblance to somebody else, or Mary is the unique and only person who's had babies within those 2 28-day windows around her 2 dates of birth. But she has 3 children. Let's see what happens when we add the third. We still get a match with 1. Okay, so now at this point, I feel pretty confident that I've genuinely re-identified the person that I think, because I think the likelihood of a coincidental resemblance to a completely different person is vanishingly small. And you'll note that we hit uniqueness after 2 dates of childbirth. And then we have this completely separate corroborating piece of information in the match for the 3rd date. But we could do even more careful checking, because remember that there's 14-day, plus or minus 14-day perturbations aren't independently chosen for each date. The health department has chosen 1 number between negative and positive 14, and they've perturbed all of Mary's dates of childbirth by that same fixed number. So let's see. Let's check whether the 3 dates that we know have all been perturbed by the same amount. And indeed, when I checked, they have. Now, this actually gives us one way of checking something about the probability of a coincidental match for somebody else. Because suppose that we had somebody else who matched all 3 of those 28-day windows, which is pretty unlikely in the first place, in my opinion. In fact, overwhelmingly unlikely, I believe, although it's hard to prove without knowing what the background probabilities are. But suppose we did have such a person. What would be the likelihood that that person also perfectly matched the exact perturbation dates of my friend? Well, we don't really know what the underlying probability distributions of the childbirth dates exactly are. So let's make the simplifying assumption that the person is equally likely to have any date in the range of those 28-day windows. Now, I know that's not exactly a perfect assumption, but just to give us a rough idea of the probability of a coincidental resemblance, the probability of a coincidental match to the exact intervals, given a coincidental match to those 3 ranges, is about 1 divided by the size of the range squared, which is about 1 in 1,000. So we're not certain that this is Mary's record, but I think we can be overwhelmingly confident that it is her record, because I think the probability of a match from somebody else who just randomly happened to be perturbed into a matching pattern is vanishingly small. All right. So now I'm going to switch across to a different and shorter example, and the summary of the. Oh no, hang on! I just realised my slides are in the wrong order. Okay, I had a slide about what the Australian government had done about this. I don't know where the slide's gone, but what the slide said was, first of all, they denied that it ever happened. And in fact, they still deny that patients are re-identifiable in the data set. Secondly, they refused to notify any of the affected people because, of course, by definition, there are no affected people because there are no re-identifiable patients in the data set. And thirdly, they tried to outlaw re-identification because everybody knows that when you have a problem, the right way to deal with it is to make it a crime to demonstrate that you've got a problem rather than trying to address, understand, and make reparations for the problem. So fortunately, the ban on re-identification did not go through. All right, so now let's change examples and talk about the second of my Australian case studies. So this is the state government of my home state of Victoria. And the state government runs the transport system. So lots of cities have these kinds of cards. Melbourne's is very, very much the same as any other large city you've ever been to. You have a little plastic card and you pay some money for a ticket, and then you use your little plastic card to prove that you've paid your fare if you want to take a bus or a train or a tram or whatever. So there's a data set held by the Victorian authorities that records for each card everywhere that person touched their card on and touched their card off. And it incorporates most trains, most buses, most trains, some buses, and all of the trams. Now, the Victorian government, in its infinite wisdom, decided that the clever thing to do with this data set was to link together all of the events on each card. And roughly a card corresponds to a person, although sometimes people share cards. And to link them all together, take everything that happened in transport in Melbourne from July of 2015 to June of 2018, including the exact routes and stops and station numbers and so forth. They included times very, very precisely up to the second, and they published it all on the internet. Now, there's no information about people at all. No demographics, absolutely nothing. Although there are different kinds of cards. So, for example, there are children's cards and adults' cards. There are cards for police officers and cards for members of parliament, and so forth. If you want to read more of the details, it's in the archive on the link at the bottom. So what do you think? How many points is it going to take to identify a person in this data set? What do you reckon? 2, basically, depending on how much detail you've got about the person and exactly what auxiliary data you've got about the person. It takes probably about 2 points of information to identify a person. So Chris Culnane first identified himself based on very accurate records of exactly when he had tapped on and tapped off at the university tram stop. Then he identified Ben Rubenstein because, of course, Ben had travelled with Chris on a couple of visits down into the city. Then we just decided to look on the internet for information about other people. And Melbourne public transport being what it is, it's astonishing how many people tweet, mostly angrily, about standing at the train station waiting for the train. So it's not hard to figure out who's tapped on when, and it's not hard to find at least 2 pieces of information for zillions and zillions of different people. 2 or 3 points suffice for uniqueness for most people, most of the time, even if you don't have one of the special little cards for members of parliament. Speaking of the special little cards for members of parliament, one of the most prolific tweeters about public transport was this guy called Anthony Carbines, who's a member of the State Parliament of Victoria. And he's actually a really enthusiastic public transport user, and as you can see, this is actually a pretty typical tweet. He's excited about showing up at 5:24 a.m. the following morning to catch the first train to town, and he did show up at 5:24 in the morning, and he did touch on. Not very many other people did so at the same time, and so we were able to fish his record very, very, very easily out of the data set. It's obvious that it's him. It'd be obvious if it would be obvious that it was him, even if he didn't have the special members of parliament card. This guy actually represents the kindest response to a privacy disclosure I've ever encountered. I called him up and told him about it, and he was relaxed and friendly and decent and reasonable, which is not always the case for contacting people and telling them that they've had a disastrous privacy breach. And he was actually pretty happy for us to talk about it. So we wrote our little paper, put it up on the web, told the Victorian government first, then wrote our paper and put it up on the web. So what did the Victorian government do about it? Well, they refused to acknowledge that commuters were identifiable. And bear in mind, there's a significant amount of intellectual creativity required to refuse to acknowledge that commuters were identifiable, given that a member of your governing party was specifically and confidently, quite unequivocally identified. But the Victorian Privacy Commissioner wrote a very detailed and damning report about the incident, which is there on the link if you're interested. So part of the theme that I want to talk about, that I want to bring out here, is that denying the problem and refusing to admit that there was a problem at a federal level actually set the scene for a repetition of the same problem at a state level. I think if the federal government, when they had their first health data breach, had come out, admitted that there was a problem, promised to do something about the problem, examined how the problem came about, and notified the affected people, I think it's much less likely that we would have had a repeat in Victoria. And so Victoria responded in a half and half kind of a way, right? The relevant authority really slammed the people who had made the data breach, but the authorities that had been responsible for the data breach still didn't admit that there was a problem and still don't. So we'll see what happens there. My last example, just in the last 5 minutes, is from the state of Queensland, which has a very extensive and detailed open data portal. And here's one example. It looks like this. So this is a data set from, I believe, all, I'm not absolutely certain it's all, but I think it's all of the people who sought treatment for alcohol or other drug problems in Queensland in particular years. And they had 4 or 5 years of data up. So this data again contains unit records, an individual record for each person. The record includes the postcode that they lived in, the postcode that they sought treatment in, their age bracket within 10 years, including an age bracket for 10 to 19-year-olds, It includes their Indigenous status, which unfortunately in Queensland can be very identifying because there are a couple of different Indigenous groups and some of them represent only actually a very small fraction of the population. And then the data set is about as horrifically sensitive as you can imagine. It identifies the person's primary problematic drug, and then it describes the other drugs that they admit to using from time to time. So it's hard to think of something less appropriate for posting on the internet than this. There is an investigation by the Queensland Privacy Commissioner into the Queensland Open Data Portal. We don't really know exactly what's happening. At least I don't know exactly what's happening. There is another important and interesting angle here, which is that privacy advocates are actually not the only people who have been objecting to this practice of publishing detailed personal information on the internet without asking. There's actually, in Australia and New Zealand and in many other countries of the world, a really active community of scholars who care about Indigenous data sovereignty. So this paper is by my friend Maggie Walter, who's a professor at the University of Tasmania, and she's writing about the representation of Indigenous people in public statistics. So if we go back to that page about alcohol and drug treatment seekers in Queensland, there are a few things that, as a geek, I immediately notice about it. Right? One is that the data is odds on to be easily re-identifiable. Another is that Indigenous people are vastly overrepresented in the data set, just by looking, you just look at the numbers and do the arithmetic. The third is that you're much more likely to be identifiable if you're Indigenous. For example, and it's just because Indigenous people are a small subset of the population. So if you, almost anything that specifically points out the 5%, and then leaves the 95% in a great big pile all of their own is going to mean that the 5% are more easily identifiable, all other things being equal. And then Maggie Walter, in this very, very sad, I think, paper that you can read online, has made a whole lot of really insightful remarks about how data that seems to be objective can actually be painting a picture of a particular group of people in a way that is not fair and is not actually representative of who the people are. So in particular, if you go, for example, somebody goes out into an Indigenous community and investigates their drug problems, but they don't necessarily bother covering the white middle class houses in the suburbs with quite the same level of detailed investigation of drug problems. And then lo and behold, Indigenous people are astonishingly overrepresented in the data set of people with drug problems. So if you read Maggie's paper, you will see really a list of things that government shouldn't do with data. And then you can look back at the Queensland Open Data Portal and they pretty much have, it's like they read through Maggie's paper and did everything that they shouldn't have done. So I just wanted to say that privacy advocates are not the only people saying that publishing people's data online without their consent is a stupid idea. All right, so what did the Queensland government do about this? They quietly took the data offline. So you go to that link that I just showed you now, and you will see that the data is no longer there. There's no message saying, we realised this was a bad idea, we've decided to take it down. There's just a sudden, unreasoned absence of that data anymore. We'll see what happens there. Okay, so in summary, I know Ross is going to talk a little bit more about differential privacy. Differential privacy is a real thing. It's a genuine scientific definition of what it means to leak information. K-anonymity is a much more ad hoc definition based on assuming that you know what identifiers the attacker is going to use. And it fails if the adversary has other auxiliary information that you didn't expect them to have. So I just think, in summary, in case it isn't obvious, that taking individual people's unit records and publishing them online without asking them is just plain wrong, and governments should stop doing it. You would think that after 3 different stupid mistakes, we would not be repeating the same problem. So I hope the next year's talk does not include 4 or 5 different stupid mistakes of the same kind. Okay, I'm going to pause there for questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vanessa. So, thank you very much, and I would like to, well, we're in these times, so this is what we can do. So one question for a country where the chance of a parliament member taking public transportation is essentially 0. How much of the information was actually from correlated from the tap on and the tap off, from the tap off point of view? Because you see, it allows you to connect, to making connections and correspondence between tracks, or you just use the entry point, the tap on one?
Yeah, all of it. That's exactly right, Or. So for the transport data, it was only tap-ons and tap-offs. So it didn't sort of have continuous data about which train you were in, but it said, you know, you tapped on at this station at this time, and then you tapped off at some other station at some other time. So that's exactly what it was.
So it allowed you to find a train and then correlate it with other things.
Yeah, exactly. And so, and once you'd found one, the data set identified that you could immediately pull from the data set every other tap on and tap off with the same card. So I now carefully, I not only buy my cards with cash, I keep 5 or 6 different cards and then just kind of randomly use different ones through the day.
You tap on with one and tap off with the other. No.
I'd probably go to jail for that, actually, or at least get fined. Yeah.
So we have a few questions in the Q&A. So I will start with one by Michal. How much anonymity does the 14-day perturbation really adds? Was this useful at all?
None. Really, none. Completely useless, especially if you've got a couple of points. I guess if you only had 1 point, maybe it would add a little bit. Basically useless. With data that detailed, it's basically useless.
So Nimrod is asking, you said the government refused to acknowledge people could be re-identified, but does the general public discourse in Australia acknowledge your findings, or this is just something that I'm rephrasing a bit, only the privacy geeks are interested in?
Yeah, it's probably a fair assessment of the situation to say only the privacy geeks are interested. So there's quite a bit of press, as you saw. Sometimes there's kind of mainstream press, but usually there's really only interest from tech journalists who care about privacy. It's quite weird, actually. If you read official reports about government data sharing, and there have been quite a few official investigations and proposals on future policy, they will often refer to Vitaly Shmatakov and Arvind Narayanan's re-identification of the Netflix dataset, and conveniently forget that there have been any similar examples in Australia. Right, so it's many people know that it happened, and many people feel that it suits them to pretend that it didn't happen. For example, one of the I believe it was the Deputy Secretary of the Department of Health, was asked in a senatorial committee about this work and asked about the re-identification of patients. And she said, oh, no, it was just about encryption, and it was only very limited.
So I'm taking a question from the chat for a second. Dr. Ajit Kumar actually mentions the fact that you seem to be using the social media for doing the identification. So I will build on his comment. If you wouldn't have Twitter or other social media available to, where would you use, what other sources of information will you be using for the identification?
Yeah, this is a really good question. So you could use whatever you had, right? And we used Twitter because Twitter was what we had. But if you were a bank, for example, and you were trying to re-identify your customers' Medicare records from that data set, you could easily use the transaction information from your banking records that you know as a bank. Right, so people pay for their medical bill and then they get reimbursed by the government. Both of those transactions would show up in the bank's database, and it would be very, very straightforward to use those transactions to re-identify the person. So the other thing that I have used is just people who came and told me information about themselves. And as you saw in the Medicare data set, there was, you really only need a few dates of childbirth. So you could use, even if you didn't have social media information, you could just use the information that you had about your friends and relations already. Not that I did. For some reason, it didn't feel creepy taking public information and checking whether the person was in the data set, but it did feel creepy taking what I knew about my friends without asking them. What else could you use? You could use anything you had, right? And I think part of the thing is that even if you think about it as health data, or you think about it as transport data, there might actually be significant other sources of information that don't count as that. So you could obviously use, I think I already said, financial transactions data to identify health records, because they're actually billing records. You could think about using other data. For example, if you were the phone company and you had access to people's location information, you could probably use that to re-identify their transport record, right? Because you know where they are at a particular time, and if they're standing at the train station at a particular place and time, then there's a very high likelihood that the tap on or tap off at that train station is them. So I think that re-identification based on Twitter is the absolute minimum that you can assume is re-identifiable in these kinds of data sets. And just about any other entity that has other detailed information about a person is very likely to be able to use that detailed information about that person to identify their records.
So this is actually a question by Michael, who says, public transport is a public event. I mean, you go on the train and everybody can see you. In Israel, everybody can hear your conversations and discussions of medical data. The amount of times I heard about people's hernias and other operations on the train was quite significant. The question is, what sort of privacy protection would you expect, A, from technology point of view, and I'm a bit expanding his question, and secondly, from law point of view, what would you expect?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So I can't speak to the law. Australia, as you saw, Australian privacy law is kind of differently interpreted even between the different states. As far as expectations, I think it's really interesting because I think I said the MP that we identified was totally relaxed about it. He didn't care. He tweeted about where he was going. He didn't care that people could also find the places that he'd been and not tweeted about. He was completely relaxed about it. And that's great. I'm happy that he's relaxed about it, and that's good. I would be concerned that there are other people who are not relaxed about it. For example, Australia has effectively compulsory child custody arrangements, including for people whose partner was abusive. There's a lot of people going and meeting their abusive ex, handing their kids over, and then going home again. So the possibility to take a record from where the person touched on or off to public transport and link that record back to the place to where they are when they go home, that would be a serious thing for at least some users of this system. Now, I don't know what the law says about that. I do know, like I said, the Victorian Privacy Commissioner did find that this publication of the data breached Victorian privacy law. Yeah. So Victorian privacy law says you're not allowed to share identifiable information, reasonably identifiable information, without the person's consent.
So this raises the question, why this database was, this is a question by Sigalit, or why the database was made public in the first place. I mean, why would you put such a dangerous thing?
Why would you do that? I know, indeed. And why would you do it for health too, right? This is the first question that I get asked whenever I describe either of these. Why would they do that? Why did they do that? And I don't know. Honestly, I don't even understand, except that I don't believe that it's accidental, right? I don't believe that there can be such a constant community, constant explanations from our community explaining that this data is identifiable and that it shouldn't be shared without the people's consent. And also, as I said, from the Indigenous data sovereignty community as well, and probably other communities as well, for all I know. And yet it keeps happening. I just don't believe that it happens by accident. I don't understand exactly why it keeps happening. And I don't believe that it's accidental that the Australian government pretends that it hasn't happened, even when it clearly has happened.
And the final question, I think, at the moment from Itzhak is, how is that work related to Denning's concept of trackers in the database?
Oh, I think Ross Anderson is going to talk about this. This is the thing where you ask specific numerical queries, and then you take a smaller subset of the population and ask the same numerical query again, and this kind of stuff, difference in queries and this kind of thing. I think I'll hand it over to Ross, because I think he's going to talk more about it in more detail.
So I would like to thank you very much for this insightful and eye-opening talk. And again, on behalf of all the participants.
Thanks, everybody. Looking forward to the rest of the meeting.
And looking forward to hearing you tomorrow morning. So don't miss out. The same time, same location, same Zoom link, same speaker, great new things. So don't hesitate.
Same scary story.
Very much.
Thank you
very much.